The night in Los Angeles settled into a heavy, predictable rhythm. Porch lights cast soft, yellow pools of illumination onto manicured lawns, while the distant hum of the city faded into a low, steady vibration. Inside the houses, the air was still. Families were tucked into bed, the day's noise replaced by the steady cadence of breathing and the occasional creak of settling floorboards. Cars sat motionless in driveways, their metal cooling in the night air with faint, metallic ticks. A sprinkler system clicked on in a nearby yard, spraying a rhythmic mist across the grass before shutting off, leaving the silence deeper than before. Everything felt anchored, secure, and perfectly normal. There was no wind to stir the palm fronds, no sirens to break the horizon, and no movement on the empty sidewalks. It was the kind of quiet that suggested nothing could ever change, a stillness so profound it felt permanent. Every window remained dark, every door locked, and every resident drifted deeper into sleep, unaware that the foundation of their safety was about to be tested. The silence remained absolute, but the atmosphere began to shift. High above the roofline of a single house, a thin, gray trail of smoke hurled into the cold air. It was faint, barely distinguishable from the shadows of the eaves, and completely ignored by the sleeping street. It rose in a slow, hypnotic spiral, twisting against the backdrop of the dark sky. No one looked out their windows. No one stepped onto their porches to notice the faint, acrid scent beginning to mingle with the night breeze. The smoke grew slightly denser, a whisper of gray against the black, yet the neighborhood continued its undisturbed rest. It was a subtle, almost invisible intrusion, a tiny fracture in the peace that had held the street together. The trail did not dissipate. Instead, it gained a steady, vertical momentum, feeding into the darkness as if the house itself were exhaling. It was easy to miss. It was easy to ignore. The quiet night held no warning, and the smoke continued its climb, marking the exact moment where the safety of the street began to dissolve. The transition was violent and instantaneous. The thin gray ribbon of smoke vanished, replaced by a sudden, hungry roar as fire tore through the interior. Flames erupted from the front of the house, shattering the glass of the living room windows and sending jagged shards onto the lawn. The orange light flared, turning the dark street into a blinding, high-contrast stage. Thick, oily black smoke billowed upward, choking the night air. Inside, the structure groaned under the intense, rapid heat. The fire climbed the walls, licking at the ceiling and consuming the curtains in seconds. Outside, the silence was shredded. A neighbor's porch light flickered and died as the fire's heat warped the electrical lines. Doors slammed open. Figures stumbled onto their driveways, squinting against the harsh, flickering glow that painted the entire block. The heat was now a physical force, pushing outward, radiating from the house like a blast furnace. The calm of the night was gone. The house breathed darkness and fire, its windows glowing with a lethal, intense heat that signaled the total collapse of the neighborhood's peace. The panic on the street shifted from confusion to a singular, piercing focus. A woman screamed, her voice cutting through the roar of the fire. She pointed toward the upper floor, her hands trembling as she grabbed the arm of a neighbor. "There are children inside!" The words rippled through the crowd, turning the frantic noise into a jagged, desperate silence. The realization hit like a physical blow. 4 children were trapped behind the wall of flames. A man from the house next door sprinted forward, his face twisted in a mask of grim determination. He reached the porch steps, his boots skidding on the melting wood. He lunged for the front door, his hand outstretched to grab the handle. The heat met him like a solid wall, a blast of furnace air that forced him to recoil instantly. He threw his arm up to shield his face, stumbling backward as the searing temperature singed his skin. The front entrance was gone, consumed by a churning, opaque curtain of fire. He collapsed onto the lawn, defeated by the sheer power of the blaze. The desperate cries from within were swallowed by the relentless, hungry roar of the fire. The street held its breath. The only sound was the rhythmic, hungry crackle of timber turning to ash. Then, a thin, high-pitched wail pierced the night, growing in volume until it vibrated in the chest of every bystander. Down the block, 2 sets of headlights cut through the thick, swirling smoke. The fire trucks rounded the corner. Tires screeched against the asphalt as the vehicles slammed to a halt, the air brakes hissing with a sharp, metallic release. Before the engines even cut, the doors swung open. The crew moved with practiced mechanical speed. They stepped onto the pavement, their eyes locked immediately on the house. It was no longer just a home, It was a breathing, pulsating entity of darkness and fire. The firefighters stood for a heartbeat, assessing the structural integrity of the walls as the heat rippled the air around them. They heard the faint, desperate cries from within. The lead firefighter signaled his team, his movements sharp and precise. They uncoiled hoses and checked their equipment, their faces set in grim lines. The main crew focused their efforts on the front, deploying heavy lines to combat the primary wall of fire. One firefighter stood back, his gaze sweeping the perimeter of the structure. He ignored the command to hold position and stepped away from the group, his boots crunching over broken glass and debris. He moved toward the side of the house, keeping his body low to avoid the rising heat waves. The fire was concentrated at the entrance, but the rear of the property remained partially obscured by shadows. He stopped. A small, narrow window sat near the ground, untouched by the immediate reach of the flames. He checked the window frame. It was clear of debris. He looked back at his crew, then turned his attention back to the glass. He took a steadying breath, gripped the sill, and prepared to breach the structure. He slammed his weight against the window. The glass did not yield at first, then shattered with a sharp, violent crack. Shards tumbled inward, clattering onto the floorboards. He did not hesitate. He hooked his arms over the sill, chadrasa, pulled his torso through the narrow opening, and kicked his legs free of the outside air. The transition was instantaneous. The relative coolness of the backyard vanished, replaced by a wall of heat that pressed against him with physical weight. He dropped to the floor, his hands finding purchase on debris. The air inside was not air. It was a thick, gray soup of smoke. He stood for a second, but the heat forced him back down. He crawled. The floor groaned under the stress of the Inferno. Above him, the ceiling crackled, a sound like dry timber snapping. He was inside the belly of the beast. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the flickering orange pulse of fire. He moved forward, his hands sweeping the floor. He kept his head low, his face inches from the floorboards where the air remained slightly thinner. The heat was a living thing, clawing at his skin and demanding he turn back. He swept his hands in wide arcs, feeling for the shape of a bed, a chair, anything that didn't belong in the wreckage. His palm struck something soft. He froze. He shifted his weight, his fingers tracing the small, limp arm of a child tucked beneath a fallen piece of furniture. The child was motionless, unresponsive to his touch. He did not waste a second. He braced his shoulder against the debris, shoved it aside with a grunt of exertion, and scooped the small body into his arms. The child was light, terrifyingly still. He turned, but the path he had taken was already changing. A support beam had collapsed, blocking his direct route. He crawled over the splintered wood, his muscles burning as he adjusted to the extra weight. The fire roared louder, a hungry sound that seemed to track his movement. He pushed through the thick, black haze, his eyes stinging, his lungs screaming for relief. He saw the faint, flickering light of the window ahead. He reached the window frame, his movements jagged and strained. He thrust his arms forward, pushing the small, limp form through the jagged opening. Outside, waiting hands reached in, grabbing the child and pulling them into the cool night air. A collective gasp rose from the street, followed by a surge of desperate, hopeful shouting. For a heartbeat, the firefighter stood at the threshold, his chest heaving, the oxygen in his mask hissing as he gulped down a ragged breath. The heat from behind him was a physical shove, pushing him toward the exit, but he did not step out. He looked at the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces. Then he looked back into the orange, swirling chaos of the interior. The house groaned, the floorboards beneath him shifting as the structure began to fail. He did not hesitate. He planted his boots firmly on the charred wood, turned his back on the safety of the night, and dived headlong back into the oven. The smoke swallowed him instantly. The interior was a furnace. Every breath he drew felt like swallowing hot needles. His instincts screamed for him to retreat, to find air, to stop the punishment his body was enduring. He silenced the urge and dropped to his hands and knees, moving deeper into the suffocating gloom. The fire had grown meaner, licking at the walls and consuming the floorboards with a relentless, crackling hunger. He crawled room by room, his fingers sweeping the debris-strewn floor. He felt the heat radiating from the ceiling, a heavy, oppressive weight that threatened to crush his resolve. He pushed past the doorway where the flames were already licking the frame. In the corner of the next room, he heard a faint, rhythmic sound against the wood. He lunged forward, his hands finding the second child huddled in the corner. He pulled the child into his chest, shielding them with his own body. The return journey was a blur of searing heat and blinding smoke. He navigated the shifting floor, his muscles burning with every inch of progress. He reached the window, his movements heavy and labored, and thrust the second child into the waiting hands outside. He did not pause to breathe. He turned back into the darkness. The third entry was a descent into a dying world. The ceiling above him crackled with the sound of snapping timber, a rhythmic, violent popping that signaled the structure was losing its fight against gravity. He pushed forward, but a sudden, massive collapse of plaster and beams blocked the main hallway, forcing him to veer into a narrow, smoke-choked corridor. Visibility was now absolute zero. He moved by touch alone, his gloved hands sliding along walls that felt like heated iron. Every movement was sluggish, his lungs burning with the intake of toxic, superheated air. The fire roared with a new, deeper intensity, vibrating through the floorboards and rattling his teeth. He stayed low, pressing his face into the floor to catch a sliver of cooler air, but the heat was everywhere. It clawed at his skin and turned his gear into a heavy, stifling weight. He reached out, his fingers brushing against charred furniture and twisted metal. He was disoriented, but he refused to turn back. He swept his hand across the floor, his fingers tracing the edge of a bed frame. There, tucked beneath the frame, he felt the small, limp form of the third child. He did not hesitate. He scooped the child up, tucking them firmly against his chest. The return path was treacherous. A beam had fallen across his previous route, forcing him to crawl over a pile of smoldering debris that shifted under his weight. His movements were slow, agonizingly labored. His lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass. He reached the opening, the light from the street cutting through the thick, swirling smoke. He thrust the child toward the waiting hands outside. A collective gasp rose from the street as the crew pulled the child to safety. The neighbors stood frozen, watching the man who refused to let the fire win. He leaned against the window frame, gasping for air, his body trembling. The crowd watched in absolute disbelief. The crowd held its breath, expecting him to collapse or climb out. He did neither. He checked his gauge, the needle hovering in the red, a silent warning that his time was effectively gone. Most would have stopped. Most would have called it a victory. He turned his back on the fresh air and stepped back into the furnace. The house gave a violent, low-frequency groan, a sound of timber snapping deep within the walls. The floor beneath his boots felt spongy, the structural integrity failing under the relentless assault of the flames. He moved with a heavy, deliberate gait, his muscles burning from the accumulated strain of the previous 3 trips. The heat here was different, more aggressive, clawing at his skin through the layers of his protective shell. The fire roared, a deafening, hungry sound that seemed to mock his intrusion. He was alone now, the last line of defense. The hallway had become a tunnel of living flame. He stayed low, his palms pressing against the floorboards, which were now hot enough to sear through his gloves. The air was no longer just smoke. It was a thick, caustic soup that burned his throat with every shallow inhalation. He pushed forward, his movements sluggish and heavy. Suddenly, a section of the wall to his left buckled, spilling burning debris across his path. He pivoted, forcing his body into a narrow crawlspace beneath a sagging joist. The heat was in physical weight, pressing down on his shoulders, demanding he stop. He ignored the searing pain in his lungs and the tremors in his limbs. He reached the end of the hallway and kicked open the door to the final room. The interior was a chaotic swirl of orange and black. He scanned the floor, his eyes watering from the intense irritation of the smoke. He moved to the center of the room, his hands sweeping across the floor, searching for any sign of movement. The fire roared above him, a hungry, rhythmic sound that echoed the pounding of his own heart. He refused to leave until he found what he came for. His hand brushed against something soft beneath a fallen shelf. He froze, then shifted the heavy wood aside with a grunt of exertion. There, curled in the corner, was the final child. He reached out, his fingers trembling as he confirmed the small, still form. He did not waste a second. He scooped the child up, tucking the small frame tightly against his chest, shielding the child from the blistering heat. The fire roared, a violent, rhythmic sound that shook the very foundation of the building. A beam above him cracked, showering the room in sparks. He ignored the searing pain on his shoulders and the way the heat clawed at his protective layers. Nothing else existed in this moment. Not the collapsing ceiling, not the toxic air, not the exhaustion pulling at his muscles. He pivoted, his boots sliding on the slick, charred floor. He focused entirely on the path back to the window, his movements driven by a single, unwavering purpose. The child was safe in his grip. He moved toward the light, every step a defiance of the inferno that sought to claim them both. He was the only thing standing between this life and the fire. The house groaned in agony, a deep, structural shriek that vibrated through his very bones. He sprinted, his boots crunching over glass and charred wood, the child held firmly against his chest. A massive beam crashed down just inches ahead, sealing the main exit path with a wall of splintered timber and fire. He did not stop. He lunged toward the window, his lungs burning with every ragged breath. The floor beneath him tilted sharply, the joists snapping like dry twigs. He pushed off the buckling floorboards, launching himself toward the sliver of night air visible through the frame. His hands hit the sill, his grip slipping on the slick, soot-covered ledge. He hauled himself up, ignoring the searing heat that licked at his back. He reached the opening, the cool night air hitting his face like a physical shock. Outside, waiting hands reached in. He extended his arms, passing the child through the frame into the safety of the crowd. As the child cleared the window, the floor behind him vanished into the basement. He scrambled over the sill, tumbling onto the grass just as the roof collapsed inward, sealing the inferno behind him. The mission was complete. The roar of the fire suddenly felt distant, muffled by the sheer weight of what had just occurred. The man lay on the grass, his chest heaving, his hands still trembling from the effort. Around him, the street had undergone a violent transformation. The shouting stopped. The frantic movement ceased. A neighbor who had been screaming only seconds ago stood frozen, mouth slightly open, eyes locked on the ruins of the house. The sirens, which had been a constant, piercing wail, seemed to fade into the background as the reality of the scene took hold. No one moved. No one spoke. The air felt heavy, charged with the sudden absence of noise. People stood in small clusters, their faces illuminated by the flickering orange glow. The panic had been replaced by a profound, hollow stillness. It was as if the entire street had collectively held its breath. He looked at the 4 children now safe, then back at the house, and finally at the crowd. The silence held firm, a testament to the shock. The stillness broke with the sharp snap of latex gloves. Paramedics moved into the circle, their movements precise and practiced. They knelt on the pavement, surrounding the 4 children. The sound of oxygen tanks hissing replaced the roar of the fire. One medic pressed a stethoscope to a small chest, listening intently, then nodded to his partner. Another wrapped thermal blankets around shivering shoulders, the foil crinkling in the quiet air. The children blinked, their faces streaked with soot, but they were breathing. Each pulse check was a deliberate, rhythmic tap against a wrist. The paramedics worked in a tight, efficient cluster, oblivious to the onlookers. They checked for burns, cleared airways, and monitored heart rates. The house behind them was a hollowed-out shell, its roof gone. Yet, on the grass, the 4 lives remained intact. The stretchers were deployed, the wheels clicking against the asphalt. The doors slammed shut, sealing them in safety. The streetlights flickered back to life as the emergency vehicles pulled away. What remained of the house was a charred skeleton, cooling in the night air. The firefighter stood on the sidewalk, his hands resting on his knees, breathing in the quiet. He watched the ambulance taillights disappear around the corner. 4 children were alive because he had chosen to walk into the fire when every instinct demanded he turn away. There was no grand speech, no applause, only the lingering scent of smoke and the weight of the night. He had faced the roar of the flames and the collapse of the walls to pull those lives back into the light. Courage was not an abstract concept here. It was the physical act of stepping forward into the heat over and over again until the work was done. As the last embers faded into gray ash, the street returned to its silence. The house was gone, but the children were safe. That was the only outcome that mattered. He turned, walked toward his truck, and left the darkness behind.